The room buzzed with a polite, academic hum, students murmuring to one another, faculty members adjusting glasses, the soft whir of cameras positioned just far enough away to pretend this wasn't a moment meant to travel beyond the walls. Barron Trump leaned back in his chair, long legs folded, posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence rather than carelessness. He had listened from the start, but not in the way most people listen. His eyes moved constantly, clocking reactions, measuring applause, noticing who leaned forward and who crossed their arms. When Barack Obama stepped to the podium, the clapping swelled, respectful and steady, but not explosive. Barron noticed that too. Obama opened with his familiar calm, measured jokes, a nod to the institution hosting him, a reminder about the importance of dialogue. Barron's lips curved into a faint smile. He had expected charm, everyone did. Charm was easy. What he was waiting for was the moment where polish cracked under pressure. As Obama transitioned into policy reflections, Barron straightened slightly, fingers tapping once against his notebook. He had come prepared. When the moderator announced the Q&A, Barron's hand went up almost instantly. A few people glanced over, surprised by his height, his age, and the unmistakable recognition that flickered across faces when they realized who he was. He stood slowly, letting the room settle. His voice was even, controlled, practiced. He framed his question carefully, weaving in a statistic about economic growth during Obama's presidency, paired with a pointed suggestion that the policies being praised hadn't delivered what they promised. It wasn't overtly disrespectful, but it was sharpened enough to draw blood if mishandled. A ripple moved through the audience. Some leaned forward, sensing tension. Others stiffened, bracing for discomfort. Barron finished his question with a deliberate pause, chin slightly raised, eyes fixed on Obama. It was the pause of someone expecting a misstep, a stumble, a defensive explanation, anything that could be clipped and replayed later. For a fraction of a second, the silence felt heavy, almost theatrical. Obama didn't rush to fill it. He rested his hands lightly on the podium, studying Barron with an expression that wasn't annoyed or dismissive, but curious. Then he smiled, not wide, not playful, but thoughtful. He thanked Barron for the question, genuinely, and asked him to repeat the statistic and where it came from. The request was simple, but it shifted the air in the room. Barron repeated it, a touch faster now, citing a report he'd skimmed more than studied. Obama nodded slowly. "That's a number people bring up a lot," he said, voice steady. "And it's an understandable concern." Barron's smile flickered. This wasn't the pushback he'd anticipated. Obama didn't counter immediately. Instead, he stepped away from the podium slightly, as if inviting the audience into a conversation rather than a debate. He began to talk about context, about how numbers, on their own, can feel definitive while telling only part of the story. He described the moment those policies were introduced, the inherited conditions, the constraints that don't fit neatly into charts. He spoke about trade-offs, about decisions made with imperfect information under real pressure. The room grew quieter with each sentence. Phones that had been subtly raised lowered again. Barron felt the shift before he fully understood it. This wasn't an answer designed to score points. It was building something, layer by layer, without ever raising its voice. Obama referenced broader data sets, trends before and after, the human implications behind abstract percentages. He didn't accuse Barron of being wrong, he showed him where the question itself had been narrowed too much. As Obama spoke, Barron's confidence thinned, not collapsing but stretching. He realized the trap he'd set was no longer relevant. There was nothing to pounce on, no defensive posture to exploit. Instead, the conversation had widened beyond the boundaries he'd drawn. The audience wasn't waiting for a winner anymore, they were listening. Obama finally circled back to Barron, meeting his eyes again. "So when we talk about whether something worked," he said gently, "we have to be clear about what we're measuring, and why." The words weren't sharp, but they landed with weight. Barron swallowed, nodding once without realizing he'd done it. The smirk he'd arrived with had vanished, replaced by a quiet, unsettled focus. The moment he'd planned had arrived, but not in the way he'd imagined. Obama let the silence sit for a beat, not as a tactic, but as an invitation. Then he did something unexpected. He asked Barron a question back. Not a trap, not a rhetorical flourish, just a simple inquiry about what outcome mattered most to him. Economic growth, wage stability, opportunity for people entering the workforce. The shift was subtle but decisive. The spotlight moved from confrontation to conversation, and everyone in the room felt it. Barron hesitated. This wasn't the script. He cleared his throat and answered honestly, choosing opportunity, the idea that systems should reward effort and innovation. Obama nodded, eyes brightening slightly, as if pleased by the sincerity rather than the content. He built from there, connecting that goal to broader policy frameworks, explaining how trade-offs often hide in the margins and how leadership is less about absolutes than about balancing imperfect choices. He spoke plainly, avoiding jargon, grounding abstract ideas in real examples, small businesses, workers retraining, communities adapting. As he talked, the room leaned in. The tension that had crackled earlier dissolved into something quieter and more focused. Obama wasn't defending himself anymore, he was mapping a way of thinking. He acknowledged mistakes openly, named areas where policies fell short, and explained why some outcomes took years to reveal themselves. The honesty disarmed any lingering resistance. It was hard to frame this as spin when the speaker was owning complexity rather than escaping it. Barron felt his posture change. He leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, listening instead of waiting. He realized that what had thrown him wasn't the depth of the response, it was the tone. There was no trace of condescension, no need to assert authority. Obama treated him like someone whose curiosity mattered, not like an adversary to be defeated. That recognition carried more weight than any rebuttal could have. When Obama finished, the applause came naturally, rising and falling without prompting. It wasn't thunderous, but it was sustained, the kind that signals appreciation rather than allegiance. The moderator thanked them both and moved to the next question, but the room hadn't fully moved on. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it. After the session ended, people stood in clusters, replaying the exchange in low voices. Barron lingered near the back, watching as students approached Obama with books and phones, asking for signatures and photos. For the first time since arriving, Barron felt invisible, and oddly grateful for it. The heat in his cheeks had faded, replaced by a restless clarity. He hadn't lost a debate. He'd encountered a different model of strength. As Obama prepared to leave, their eyes met across the room. There was no grin, no victory glance, just a small nod, steady and respectful. Barron returned it before he could overthink the gesture. In that brief exchange, there was an understanding. That didn't need words. The moment hadn't been about embarrassment after all. It had been about exposure, not of weakness, but of approach. Later, outside in the cooling air, Barron replayed the scene. He thought about the pause before Obama answered, the way he asked questions instead of firing back, the patience it took to widen a conversation rather than narrow it. He recognized, with a quiet jolt, that confidence didn't announce itself. It didn't need an audience to validate it. It simply operated, calmly, leaving others to decide whether to meet it on its terms. By the time Barron walked away, the night felt different than when he'd arrived. He'd come looking for a moment to seize, a headline to manufacture. Instead, he'd been handed a lesson, one that wouldn't trend, but would linger. He understood now that being right was less impressive than being prepared to learn, and that true authority wasn't about silencing a room, but about guiding it. He disappeared into the crowd, taller than most, quieter than before. The exchange would be talked about, dissected, misinterpreted by some. But for Barron, the takeaway was simple and personal. He hadn't embarrassed a former president. He'd been shown, in real time, how composure, curiosity, and respect can turn a challenge into something far more lasting than a win.